Putin has a problem. I feel like we say this a lot on this channel, and it's usually due to something that Ukraine has done to expose Russia's leader, but not this time. Putin's latest problem is developing far away from Ukraine's territory, though it could be just as explosive in terms of the impact it has on Russia and Putin's legacy. Something big is breaking in Chechnya, and Russia's leader can't change what's coming. Putin's next war is about to begin. But it's not going to be against the NATO nation or an escalation of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. The next enemy comes from inside Russia itself, and it could end Putin. And everything revolves around one man, Ramzan Kadyrov. Since 2007, Kadyrov has served as the president, or more accurately, the ruthless dictator, of the Russian Republic of Chechnya. Under his rule, Chechnya has remained under Russian sway, despite having fought several times for independence. Kadyrov is far from a calming influence. He is a brutal man who has implemented Sharia law and cracked down on any attempt by those inside Chechnya who want independence to separate themselves from Russia. That's why Putin values Kadyrov. He's a hatchet man who wields his axe to ensure Russia maintains its influence, not only in Chechnya, but in the entire Caucasus region. But Kadyrov is dying. At least that's the rumor that started doing the rounds earlier in 2026. January saw the Moscow Times report that both Russian and Ukrainian media had been speculating that Kadyrov was suffering from kidney failure that may well be terminal. Of course, these were just rumors at the time, but they're starting to look like realities that Putin will soon have to face. In recent months, Kadyrov has been making moves that indicate he is looking to secure the place of a potential successor, or at the very least, ensure the safety of his family in a country where war between different clans is always a possibility. Kadyrov's children, who are young and have very little government experience, are being placed in key government roles. Nepotism? Perhaps, but also a strange move being carried out by a dictator who himself is fairly young. Even stranger are the marriages of several of Kadyrov's children to officials in Chechnya. If you know anything about history, you know that marriage between the children of world leaders was often used as a way to build alliances and protect oneself from attack. Chechnya's clan-based society often works similarly. So the marriages that Kadyrov's children are undergoing, just as with their promotions to key governmental roles, are all signs that Kadyrov is desperately trying to prepare his family for a future that doesn't have him in it. The man is making moves that suggest he is going to die soon, and it's this fact that is creating such a massive problem for Putin. What we're seeing here is a looming succession crisis that looks set to engulf Chechnya. For Putin, who has long relied on the stability that Kadyrov brings, at least in terms of his ability to subjugate Chechnya's clans, that succession crisis is a killer for Russia's position in the Caucasus. As Foreign Policy points out in a June 4th article, Chechnya has a history of generating chaos that is far beyond its relatively small size, and much of that chaos is focused on a desire among many in the country to achieve independence from Russia. If Kadyrov truly is on the verge of dying at the relatively young age of 49, that means Chechnya is on the verge of plunging into chaos. After all, when the strongman disappears, there is nobody to control the clans that still want to fight against Russia. Right now, Putin has to be asking himself a big question: who comes after Ramzan Kadyrov? Chechnya's current leader appears to be trying to groom his 18-year-old son, Adam, for the role. For Russia, that would be an ideal solution in some respects. It could allow Putin to provide an advisor, almost like a king's regent, to the new ruler, thus ensuring that Russia's influence pervades in Chechnya. But even this ideal scenario is fraught with problems. Adam Kadyrov is young, too young. That's why the subject of a regent would come up in the first place. This youth makes Kadyrov's son a much bigger target than Kadyrov himself. Adam could be seen as weak, a child in a man's job who could be targeted by other clans, especially those led by Kadyrov's rivals, who have been driven into exile. There are other children that Kadyrov could try to position as a new leader before he dies. Akhmat, who is a little over a year older than Adam, is the intellectual of the brood, The Spectator says. But he is also devoid of charisma, and his father doesn't appear to consider him to be a worthy successor. Zelim Khan has the bloodlust that his father has, but he's so wild that he has essentially been banished to exile in the United Arab Emirates, so he seems to be out. That leaves Adam. A weak successor to a leader whose health appears to be failing, cast into the role of the man whom Putin has to rely upon to maintain his influence in Chechnya. The reality is that the death of the older Kadyrov is going to lead to a period of chaos in Chechnya. Even if one of the sons is elevated, Putin can hardly rely on the sort of iron grip that has allowed Russia to maintain its control over one of the most rebellious republics for almost 2 decades. A fight is incoming. And to understand more about why, we need to look a little deeper into the recent history of Chechnya in relation to Russia. We take you back to the 1990s and into the early 2000s. Do you remember that drive for independence that we mentioned is still very much alive in many of Chechnya's clans? That drive was at its peak during the late 20th century, as Chechnya engaged in a pair of wars with Russia that left deep scars on the nation. For Putin, those wars were opportunities. The second, in particular, saw him brutally bring Chechnya under control as he managed to turn Ramzan's father, Ahmad, to his side. By the end of the two wars, the blood of 160,000 people had been spilled, up to 40,000 of whom were Chechen fighters and civilians, with the rest being representatives of various ethnic groups, as the Jamestown Foundation puts it. Most were Russian. But that didn't matter to Putin. What was important to him was that Chechnya was under control, and it has remained that way for around 2 decades. All of this means that Putin rose to power on the back of Chechen suppression. That's not just important in Chechen society, which has experienced 2 decades of brutality and the constant influence of Russia, encouraged by the country's dying leader. It was also vital for Putin. He could use his exploits, some might say war crimes, in Chechnya to establish his own strongman image. Putin solved the Chechen problem. He could solve any other problem that Russia faced. Only Putin didn't anticipate that a ruler who should have outlived him would end up on his deathbed far too early. And if Kadyrov dies, the potential for mass protests, renewed rebellion, and political mobilization among Putin's enemies is all on the table. Another war would have to be fought to control all of this. But this is where the Ukraine war becomes a major factor. Chechnya has played an interesting role in that war. On the one hand, those loyal to Kadyrov have fought on Russia's side throughout the conflict, but there are many Chechens who have instead taken up arms for Ukraine. GIS reports that those who fight for Ukraine are often generally supportive of Ukraine maintaining its sovereignty. However, they also want to learn, to see how Russia fights and understand what Ukraine does to defend itself. Ukraine has cleverly encouraged this desire among some Chechens to learn in preparation for their battle for independence. In 2022, Ukraine officially recognized Chechnya's independence from Russia, in what was both a thumbing of the nose toward Putin and a signal to anyone in Chechnya who wished to fight that Ukraine would support their cause. The opportunity for that independence battle hadn't arisen until now. For decades, Putin has relied on one person and his brutal regime to control the desire for independence among many of those inside Chechnya. Now that one person appears to be on the brink of death. A power vacuum is forming, and those whom Kadyrov would prefer to take his place are too vulnerable to guarantee an easy transition for Putin. A fight is coming, and it's one that Russia isn't prepared for after more than 4 years of brutal war in Ukraine. And this is just the start of Putin's problems. What's happening in Chechnya right now is combining with other challenges in the Caucasus regions and among Russian republics that showcase the slipping of power out of Putin's grasp. But before we dig deeper into all of that, you're watching The Military Show, and this is why we make videos, to show how power really moves. Hit subscribe if you like what you see. We publish videos every single day. Now, why does Russia care so much about Chechnya? After all, the country is far from a major power, with a population of around 1.5 million and covering an area of just 17,300 square kilometers. Chechnya is almost more like a large city than it is a full-blown nation. However, small though it may be, Chechnya is crucial to Russia for several reasons. First up, Chechnya's location. It lies north of the Caucasus Mountains, which are vital because they allow whoever controls the territory around those mountains to also control access in and out of the West Asian region. Countries like Turkey and Iran are accessed via this mountain range, and it also served as a buffer zone for Russia. Not that Russia is at risk of attack from this direction, but when has that ever mattered to paranoid Putin? He still wants control over the Caucasus Mountains because he always wants to be ready for an attack. Plus, maintaining control feeds into his narrative of being the great Russian protector. A base is covered. Chechnya gives Russia control over a buffer zone that guards the motherland. But with Kadyrov seemingly on his deathbed, that control is starting to slip, and it gets worse. To the south of this mountain range lies Armenia, another region that Russia has been trying to control. Armenia took a massive step toward de-Russification in June. An election was held, and it resulted in Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan obtaining almost 50% of the vote and the main seat of Armenian power. Pashinyan overcame Russian-backed opposition and a massive disinformation campaign to achieve victory, and it seems likely that he's going to push for European Union membership, along with deeper ties to the West. What all of this means is that Russia's hold over territory to both the north and south of the Caucasus Mountains is under threat in a way that we haven't seen for decades. Armenia's shift has been gradual, conducted over many years. The crisis in Chechnya will be explosive, triggered by the death of one man. But in both cases, we see Russian influence waning. Putin tried as hard as he could to force Armenia into electing a Russia-friendly prime minister. Russia launched disinformation campaigns about Pashinyan. Putin made demands of Pashinyan during an April 1st meeting, along with threats about trade embargoes that Russia implemented as the election drew near. The point of no return, as Russian mouthpieces put it, was crossed without Armenia looking back. And in the end, Putin saw that his machinations were useless. To him, the West won in Armenia, and his grip on the Caucasus loosened. Now, with the Chechnya crisis looming, that loosened grip could fall apart entirely amidst infighting and Russia's inability to subjugate on behalf of a Kadyrov-appointed leader due to expending so much of its military on the war in Ukraine. That brings us to another interesting point. Chechnya is a republic of Russia. Though somewhat autonomous, it still falls under the control of Putin and is subject to many of Russia's laws. This is far from an uncommon arrangement. In fact, Russia has 21 republics, though it claims 22 when including illegally annexed Crimea. Imagine this scenario. Kadyrov dies, and the inexperienced son he chooses to succeed him fails. Despite Russia's best efforts, another Chechen clan gains power and restarts the fight for independence that colored so much of Putin's early political career. Only this time, Russia is drained due to the Ukraine war. Russia has lost over 1.39 million soldiers. 12,000 tanks have been destroyed in Ukraine, along with more than twice as many armored vehicles. And even though Russia has a large enough army to fight against Chechen rebels, every soldier sent into the Republic is a soldier who can't go to Ukraine. Putin would have to prioritize, and Ukraine would remain his key focus. Putin can't stop the Chechen push. Chechnya succeeds and becomes independent. What does that mean for Russia's other republics? For some of them, it shows that independence is possible. Now, this doesn't mean that all 21 of Russia's republics would follow Chechnya's lead, but there are a few that have active independence movements of their own, and they will be possible candidates for becoming the next to decouple themselves from Russia. Back in February 2023, the results of online voting for an interesting poll named the National Online Referendum on Self-Determination of National Republics were published. Those polls were held in 5 Russian republics, and the results in all showed a desire for independence. Kuban was the republic that seemed most closely tied to Russia, with the vote for independence being just 55.7%. A majority, but not overwhelming. In Siberia, 63.9% said they want their republic to become independent. In Ingria, it was 66.2%. The Urals saw 68.2% vote for independence, and in the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, 72.1% said they wanted to rid themselves of Russia. Of course, the caveats here are that the poll was somewhat informal, and it's unclear how many people who didn't vote would have chosen Russia. Still, every single one of these results suggests there are large contingents of people in these Russian republics who desire sovereignty, just as there is in Chechnya. If Kadyrov dies and Russia fails to hold on to this key republic, especially if that failure happens due to the military weakness caused by Putin's Ukraine war, that could be a signal. Other republics might try to follow. If they did, they will be buoyed by reports suggesting that Russia's defense ministry has hit a production dead end, and that some polls, such as the one reported on by Pravda on June 19th, suggest that over 60% of Russians are tired of the Ukraine war, never mind others that Putin might try to start. Sure, Putin could start more wars. He could send troops to Chechnya and cause yet more bloodshed, perhaps even help to keep Kadyrov's chosen successor on the throne. But he'd only create more anger and resentment if he did. The same goes for the other 5 republics we mentioned. None can really stand up to Russia militarily, but that isn't really the point. Inspired by Chechnya's push, assuming it comes, they could all stand up. And even if they're put down, the message will be broadcast all over the world, and inside Russia itself, Putin is losing control. On top of all of that, every push for independence that happens inside Russian territory is another distraction from a Ukraine war that is already going terribly. A special military operation that was supposed to last days is now well into its 5th year, which is why so many Russians are war-weary. Adding more wars on top of that seemingly endless conflict could be a recipe for disaster when it comes to Putin's reign. Enemies lurking in the shadows and looking for a reason to push Putin out could pounce. A 73-year-old man would find his focus split far too much, leading to something falling through the net. What's happening in Chechnya could be the start of Putin's downfall. It would also showcase the true limitations of Putin's power. Still, all of this is conditional on Kadyrov dying and the succession crisis that most anticipate actually happening. Let's assume all of this comes to pass, and it ultimately results in another Chechen war that forces Russia out of Chechnya for good. That allows us to look at all of this from another angle: the impact on Putin and the legacy that he wants to leave behind. It's no big revelation that Putin is incredibly concerned about the legacy that he is going to leave behind. He wants to be viewed as one of the great Russian leaders when he dies. It's why he was so brutal in his campaign to control Chechnya earlier in his reign. That thirst for legacy is one of the major motivators of the entire Ukraine war. Perhaps Putin's main goal is to leave Russia having established it once again as a major geopolitical player, and it will all be thanks to him. If Chechnya is lost amidst a succession crisis that Putin can't control, that will be his ultimate legacy. The man who subjugated the Chechen Republic lost it again 2 days later due to his own incompetence, all as he failed to take Ukraine and set the stage for other disenfranchised republics to push for their own independence. Putin would go down in history as a leader who lost Russia's access to the Caucasus Mountains. The early defining actions of his presidency would count for nothing. And when he is rotting in the ground, Russia and the rest of the world will see him as a weak failure. That is Putin's greatest fear, which means he will do whatever he can to maintain Russia's hold over Chechnya. But whatever he can doesn't mean much when his country is embroiled in the Ukraine war. Putin has no plan B for Chechnya. Ramzan Kadyrov was supposed to outlive Putin, thus keeping the Russian leader's legacy secure. Oh, and by the way, there's a Chechen government in exile in Ukraine as we speak. That government has operated in exile since Chechnya's defeat during the Second Chechen War in 2000. And it claims to have 29 branches in 14 European countries. Wouldn't it be the perfect form of poetic justice for Putin to lose Chechnya to the very government that he ousted over 25 years ago, and for that government to come back into power after receiving support from Ukraine, which is the nation Putin wants to conquer next? That's a possible future that Putin might face. And if Kadyrov dies, he may need to face that future sooner rather than later. All that Putin has left now is hope that the Chechnya crisis will somehow work itself out. Russia's leader is in the same position in terms of trying to maintain his grip over Crimea, but it isn't working. Putin's Crimea is on the verge of being over, and it's all due to Ukraine's brilliant strategy. Find out more about another so-called Russian republic that is on the brink of de-Russifying in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to hit subscribe so you can keep up with the military show and our coverage of Russia's many failures. And thank you for watching.